There's a lot of criticism that gets thrown at Britpop for being all kinds of things, too laddish, too derivative, too conventional, too jingoistic, too establishment. And arguably it was all of those things, but it was also an incredibly exciting time to be getting into music. Brash, bold, dramatic, and accessible. I was about 11 or 12 when it really blew up in 1995, and for me it was the beginning of my obsession with all kinds of music. Getting into Blur and the rest was what propelled me to all the music I enjoy, from Coltrane to Caribou. The catalyst for it all was Britpop. The overriding stereotype of that era is the lads in the Ben Sherman shirts with an obsession of trying to sound like a 60s British invasion group, with a sprinkling of the more art school crowd pulling from Bowie in the early 70s and new wave and punk from the end of that decade. But there was a lot more going on in the shadows cast by the headline grabbers. Stuff which had enough of a penchant for melody and songcraft to get chucked into the Britpop pigeonhole, but with more going on under the hood than just a handful of chords and a few copies of Loaded magazine. So with this video, I wanted to take a look back at 3 albums from that period that I still love to this day, but don't get quite as much attention as some of their contemporaries like Part Life and What's the Story Morning Glory. Let me know your suggestions for overlooked albums from that period in the comments, but for now, here is 3 albums from the Britpop era that I think are overlooked and deserve more frequent attention. Welcome to 2020 Sound, the channel where we take a look back at the more cult aspects, the more overlooked aspects, you might say, of indie and alternative rock history. If that sounds like something you'd like to watch more videos about, then do please subscribe. Now, I'd like to kick this off by taking a look back at an album that over the years has wormed its way under my skin and grown ever closer to my heart, which is perhaps slightly too anatomical a description for its own good, seeing as this band in particular were named after a term which cannibals use to describe human flesh. I'm talking, of course, about the Longpigs and their fantastic 1996 debut album, The Sun Is Often Out. This record is like the cheekier younger brother of Radiohead's The Bends. If The Bends spends its Friday nights alone in its apartment in a thick fog of weed smoke and paranoia and introspection, then The Sun Is Often Out is out there swaggering from pub to club, stealing kisses and other people's taxis before waking up in someone else's bed, filled with similar fears and regrets to his older brother. Because for all its swagger, it's still got lyrics as beautifully poetic as I'm leaving the light of baby Jesus far behind.
For one with history leaking from her eyes.
British indie at that time had a self-confidence and self-belief across the board that definitely wasn't as prevalent before, and I don't think has ever been quite so prevalent since. And The Sun Is Often Out captures that conviction perfectly. But it's a conviction that's entirely justified, because despite being so of its time, the band pull this music off with such skill that it just keeps me coming back again and again. By the way, while I remember, bonus fact for you here, the Longpigs guitarist is in fact Mercury-nominated singer-songwriter Richard Hawley. Just wanted to throw that in there before I carried on, because if you ask me, that's quite a cool little tidbit, if you didn't already know. The songwriting is fantastic. I used to think the album was too front-loaded as a kid, because it starts with 4 of the singles that came off the album, 4 of the very best singles of that period. Lost Myself. She Said. Bar. And on and on. As a kid, I used to kind of switch off a bit after that, because I was all about the singles and it kind of felt like the pacing was a bit off, like a film that crammed all its most iconic scenes in the opening act. But I was wrong. Over the years, I've come to realise that this album is not just crammed full of potential singles, but also just wonderful songcraft. Whilst they've got incredible choruses throughout the whole album, when a band can write really memorable bridges and middle eights, that's what really wins me over. If you come away from a song singing the middle eight, you know you're dealing with high caliber songwriters. And one of my absolute favourite examples of that is the middle eight from All Hype. Singer Crispin Hunt is one of the greatest of that period in my opinion. He's got tons of charisma in his voice, a fantastic range, able to turn from gentle beauty to wild abandon on a dime. Again, there's parallels with Tom York at that time. They both had this vulnerability and falsetto that Jeff Buckley made it okay for singers to wield, but combined with this energy and this venom that could snap at any time, like a cat that lets you tickle its tummy before it just sinks its teeth and claws in. That kind of tension bristles throughout the whole album. It teeters between pleasure and pain, bursting and collapsing between sleaziness and beauty and threat and joy. There's two infamous stories about the Longpigs, one involving Crispin gate crashing the Booker Prize winners party armed with a stolen goldfish, the other involving their late drummer Dee Boyle glassing Crispin in the face shortly after his departure from the band. Upon reading both, if they are indeed both true, neither surprised me because of the wildness and the emotion that runs throughout The Sun Is Often Out. It's a deeply passionate album, and it's that passion that lingers. The following year, 1997, the term Britpop was in decline, but that renewed interest in British guitar bands saw many of them take big creative strides forward. Expanding sonic palettes was rife, and two of the very best albums to do that year were, in my opinion, Attack of the Grey Lantern by Mansun and Radiator by Super Furry Animals. Both of these albums sound like they would have been a ton of fun to make. They're both the sound of skilled pop songwriters experimenting and playing around with different styles and ideas and sounds and instruments and whatever else they could get their hands on. They're kids in a candy store, bulls in a china shop, but instead of china and candy, the shops have maybe a few synths, sequencers, an orchestra or two, and maybe just over there on the back shelves the mariachi band. A lot of Britpop was meat and potato, but albums like these, they were throwing fresh ingredients into the mix. They were throwing some harissa paste into the mix. For all the talk of Oasis being the Beatles of the 90s, it was albums like this that really, truly captured that sort of, you know, the spirit of something like Abbey Road or the White Album. Like, I can't imagine for a second Liam Gallagher singing a song like Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey. But I can totally picture Gruff Rhys from Super Furry Animals singing that after a song like Chupacabras, perhaps the greatest song ever written about a blood-sucking, demonic vampire beast that kills goats. Even today, Radiator comes on like a sugar rush of fresh sounds. It's a very well-paced album. It knows when to take its foot off the pedal, but when it floors it, like on, say, the international language of screaming, it's pure E numbers straight to your ears. I'm not sure there's ever been a guitar pop band that's decorated its songs with as many weird and wonderful sounds as this. Radiator is up there with Brian Eno era Roxy music for the sheer amount of weird little noises that pepper these tunes. Some of it is studio effects like phasers and EQ. but a lot of it sounds like it's coming from whatever keyboard player Kian Kieran had in his box of tricks at the time. Actually, if this Uncut article is anything to go by, then it was probably producer Gorwell Owen who owned the box of tricks that resulted in some really cool sounds like this. It makes for just a really fun album, even on the slower songs like the light as aloft sway of bass tuned to D-E-A-D. Or probably my favourite Furry song full stop, the wonderful Demons. But the demons ever need to know, but the demons ever got to see. There's a joyousness to it that set it apart from a lot of what was going on in 1997. You couldn't get much further away from the misery of The Drugs Don't Work by The Verve with its cats in a bag waiting to drown than the absurd brilliance of Herman Loves Pauline, a song which references Einstein's parents and still to this day has one of the greatest opening lines I've ever heard. Herman loves Pauline and Pauline loves Herman. They made love and gave birth to a little German. Speaking of absurd brilliance, Attack of the Grey Lantern remains a charmingly weird concept album, or rather a parody of a concept album, as singer Paul Draper once put it. Although surely the fact that it's a parody does make it a concept album because the parody is the concept. Anyway, in an interview with Select magazine at the time, Draper said, "Well, the Grey Lantern is like a comic book hero." Which makes sense because, side note, the character is based off the DC Comics superhero Green Lantern. The album is about this village of people with really disgusting morals, and the Grey Lantern sorts them out. I suppose the Grey Lantern's me. I wouldn't have a cape, but there are definitely characters on the record: Albert Taxlos, Chad, Dark Mavis. At the end of the album, it all gets resolved and you find Mavis is actually the stripper vicar. If you've never heard this album, this all, no doubt, sounds crazy. And to be honest, even if you have heard it, it doesn't make a great deal more sense. It manages to be dark and colourful and creepy and whimsical, and with this cast of characters, these bunch of weirdos in a village, it's almost like it could have soundtracked The League of Gentlemen or maybe a David Lynch directed episode of Last of the Summer Wine. Few bands have ever blended the sublime with the ridiculous as successfully as Mansun. The strings from the opener The Chad Who Loves Me are amongst the most achingly beautiful I've ever heard. Then a few songs later, Paul Draper's basically rapping over drum loops about a vicar who's got a side gig as a stripper. You have the uneasy anthemic creepiness of Wide Open Space. Just a few songs before the strange, ridiculous layeriness of Egg-Shaped Fred. The diversity in tone and style shouldn't work, but it does. I think it's because it's not just so delightfully warped and not only delivered with this strong pop sensibility to tie it all together, but also this really strong sense of British identity. You could only ever get a line like, coming from a British band. It's distinctively Brit pop, but with a strong prog sensibility. In some ways, I imagine Mansun are what Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd may have sounded like had they somehow been transplanted to the 90s. This mishmash of contemporary sonic exploration with quirky, character-driven songs. All three of these albums boasted some top 40 hits and even a top 10er in Mansun's She Makes My Nose Bleed. In fact, Grey Lantern went to #1, knocking Blur off the top spot. But since then, I'd say all three of these albums have been somewhat overshadowed by their more famous contemporaries. So it doesn't hurt to give them a tip of the hat every now and then. Because for me, they're not just amongst the best of the Britpop era, but they're also amongst the most enjoyable of that whole decade, and indeed the last 30 years. The Britpop era, for its sins, produced a great deal of brilliant music, some of which got overshadowed by the bands in the media spotlight, so do please let me know your suggestions for overlooked albums from the Britpop era in the comments. And if you'd like to watch more videos about this kind of thing, overlooked, underrated, whatever you want to call it, music from indie and alternative rock history, then do please subscribe.